Do you have any personal experiences of being discriminated against as a Romani person in America?
5 cop cars pulled up around me, and a police officer came out and said, "We have a picture of you. You're a runaway. We know you're a nomad." I was terrified. I thought I was going to be arrested. I thought I was going to be shot. I was looking at their guns. I regularly had students complain that they didn't want a gypsy for a professor. Today in Europe, 90% of the Romani population is impoverished. That's crazy. We are in a situation where some Romani people in the world literally have to steal to survive or literally have to beg to survive.
Fortune telling is a survival adaptation, not a mystical power.
I was like 3 years old, and she said that I tore the pain out of her and threw it across the room and then marched off. And she was like, "Oh, she'll be good at this."
I want to have you read my palm.
I love getting to know people. And so what better way to marvel at the wonders of humanity than to talk with a stranger about their secrets?
And she said, you're going to meet the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with within the next calendar year. 8 months after that, I met a woman.
Have you lived the experience of being a real gypsy? Can you really use that word? No, you're profiting off of it, and like profiting off of our actual persecution so you can play gypsy for fun. It's very upsetting to me. And I had a moment where I like almost started to cry in front of her, and it shocked her so much. And I was like, "I'm sorry, I just need a moment," because why would you say that? Like, why would you say that? And she couldn't answer.
So you are a proud Romani citizen's not the right word, but of Romani heritage, which I feel like is a term that no one in America is really familiar with. The more familiar term that we all have heard is gypsy. We'll talk about why that's a term we should probably stray away from. But I feel like we're kind of undereducated on who the Romani people are. So just act like we're all stupid. And can you tell me who the Romani people are, where they come from?
Yeah, I love talking about this. So thank you so much for having me on. It's really nice to make some local connections, and it was so fun reading for you. So the Roma are a diasporic ethnic group. So diasporic is basically no longer with a homeland, originally from India around the 10th century. And now Roma live all over the world except Antarctica. I think we're on every continent. And we are often confused for a lot of different groups, and there are lots of good reasons for that. So first, Roma left India in waves around, starting in the 10th century because of the invading Ghaznavid Empire coming into India. And so the first Roma were actually an enormous army. And the culture developed over a century, essentially sprung up on camps outside of the battlefield. And so when the Ghaznavid Empire defeated, it was like basically Muslims versus the Hindus, defeated India, they captured a lot of those soldiers, and many of them decided to move west, even if they hadn't been captured. Some of them went back to India. And so you had Roma arriving in different parts of the world over centuries. And when Roma arrived in Europe around the 1400s, it was the tail end of the Crusades. It was a lot of dark-skinned people speaking a foreign language, maybe worshiping many gods. It went terribly. And so they were met with 500 years of enslavement in the Balkans, especially like present-day Romania, and waves of genocide and persecution, forced deportations, all kinds of things. And a lot of this discrimination, oppressive laws, they still exist, even in America, against Romani people. Roma were also likely a big part, or at least a part, of the transatlantic slave trade, and probably ended up in the Americas, the Caribbean, South and Central America through that slave trade, because those two periods of enslavement were concurrent. And so people think we're Romanian because there are a lot of Roma in Romania, and it sounds similar. People think we're Egyptian because initially when Roma arrived in Europe, they thought they were from Egypt. The locals thought they were from Egypt. And a lot of the Romani people, there's evidence that they thought that would go down better than India for some reason. They were like, maybe they like Egyptians more. And so they didn't really correct it. And so you'll hear the word gypsy used quite a lot more in the UK. Because of that misnomer, really, because the Egyptian shorted to gypsy, it's a legal term. And so a lot of UK Roma do feel very strongly about the word gypsy being a neutral term, but that is really culturally specific. And it is used as a slur in the US and other places. I've, had people call me a gypsy and spit on me. It's definitely used as a slur. And even the words that are synonymous with gypsy in other languages in other countries, like the word in Romanian means slave. And so it's pretty problematic. So the way that we feel about it, or I feel about it at least, is that I am fine with whatever Romani people want to call themselves. If you want to call yourself a gypsy, that's great. My grandma called herself a gypsy. My mother called herself a gypsy. I'm only Romani through my maternal grandmother. I'm mixed. I grew up assimilated, not within culture, but I was closest to my maternal grandmother. So it was a really big part of me. But I really don't think it's okay for non-Romani people to use the word gypsy and appropriate it. In America, we have more of an issue where it's used more colloquially to mean like, oh, I was gypped, to mean like I was cheated, but that means like I was cheated as it were a gypsy. And so that's problematic, like everyday racism that most people aren't even aware of. And I'm very, compassionate that a lot of people just don't know better, but I kind of feel like once you know better, please do better. I've definitely done and said ignorant things like all my life.
Yeah, we all do.
But the problem that we run into a lot in the US, especially in the fortune-telling community, but also in fashion, is that people will use the slur gypsy to conjure stereotypes that have negatively impacted Roma for centuries. Us being like witches or magical sorcerers, which has led to our persecution. Us being nomads, which has been born of persecution. Nomadism is something that is born of persecution, not just because we're delightful, wanderlusty people, although we are delightful. And also gypsy as a criminal, or somehow outlaw or outside of society. And so when you have people profiting off of the stereotypes that actively oppress Romani people and use the word in such a way that it erases that this is a real ethnic group, a real, people of color who are persecuted actively today, it's a huge problem. You're profiting off of racism. And most of the time, but not always, it's white people or white passing people who are using this term and using this word and making money off of it. Even doing trades that we're persecuted for, like fortune telling. Most of the fortune telling laws in the US are born out of anti-gypsy sentiment, or meant to persecute other people who practice fortune telling as a survival trade. Like, for instance, Tennessee, cowrie shell reading is outlawed. That's actively anti-Black legislation. And so, my thing is like, if it doesn't apply to you, it doesn't belong to you. So if you're not ethnically Romani, even if you're like, oh, I'm a mutt, or like I'm Egyptian or whatever, or I'm Romanian, girl, I'm sorry. It's not for you. And that's my thought on it. But if you're a Roma, call yourself whatever you want.
What's the reason that the Romani people have been discriminated against? What do people point to? Where was that born out of? Why don't we just leave you guys alone? What's the reason for you guys being discriminated against?
This was really born when Romani people arrived in Europe initially. And like I was saying, it was at the tail end of the Crusades. So a lot of this anti-Roma sentiment was actually created by the church and has been sustained by the church. And so, and that's also true when we're looking at other types of racism. Usually it's religion, colonization, or some combination of those things. And so while Roma have not been, Roma don't have land to colonize, there's definitely been a cultural colonization of Romani people. Wherever we've landed, we've been told we're not acceptable. And so whenever an ethnic group is marginalized, or any group of people is marginalized, usually they have much higher rates of poverty. Today in Europe, 90% of the Romani population is impoverished. That's crazy. And a high percentage of that population doesn't even have access to clean water. And so when you have extremes of treatment, you also have extremes of behavior. And so we are in a situation where some Romani people in the world literally have to steal to survive, or literally have to beg to survive. And that's not because we like it. Of course, you get criminals in every culture. It's not an ethnic thing. But I think just our otherness has been the reason we're discriminated against by the majority. But then we've also found communities where we are accepted and we connect with. Like, I know in the United States, a lot of Romani people have good relationships with indigenous people or like other groups that have been marginalized. But also Roma do tend to see ourselves as very other. And when you grow up more traditionally, like my Romanistan podcast co-host, Paulina, she was really encouraged not to have friendships with non-Romani people, not to connect with non-Romani people, because there's so much fear. Like, we can't trust them. They're not like us. You know, after many centuries of persecution, you have a lot of Roma also not wanting to mix with society, which is hard, but that's not all Roma.
I'm curious about kind of the footprint of the Romani people in America. I'd like to ask you, do you have any personal experiences of being discriminated against? Now you live in New Hampshire. You spent a lot of your life, if not all of your life, in New Hampshire.
I have actually been elsewhere for like 15 years, but I came back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you came back. They always come back. So do you have any personal experiences of being discriminated against as a Romani person in America?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I think I'll do a brief tour of some key incidents. Most Romani people, if you listen to our podcasts or listen to other Romani podcasts like Dead Scared Entertainment's Over da Danarno, or the Romani Tea Room, or Romatopia, you'll hear people who didn't grow up in community maybe, or who did but were mixing with community more, who were more assimilated, everyone in their family saying, don't tell anyone you're a Gypsy. And so that's kind of the rule. It's like, just don't say it. And that's why Roma are hard to keep track of on censuses, because we're like, no, we're Italian. We're like, we're Mexican. Don't worry about it. My grandma told me that when I was probably like 4 or 5, when she started kind of explaining what our culture was and where she came from. She grew up in Nazi Germany, where Roma were actively persecuted against Jewish folks and other ethnic groups and cultural groups, political groups.
Right. That's an often forgotten part of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
is the Romani people were, like, a very large number of Romani people were taken in the
Absolutely.
Holocaust.
Probably over 1 million, which at the time was a really huge part of the population. There are more Roma today, but back then that's always horrifying. Like, any amount of genocide is horrifying. But I think I'm harping on that because the number is often downplayed. But so my grandma told me not to tell anyone. I got to school in New Hampshire. I think I'm brownish. I'm not, I'm like ethnically ambiguous. I'm not dark skinned. But in New Hampshire at that time, I kind of stood out as being different. And so kids wanted to know, like, where are you from? Like, what are you? And I hung out with my grandma so much, I had a very faint accent. And kids were always like, you're foreign. Where are you from? And eventually I just sort of broke down, probably when I was like 6. And I was like, like, my mom's a Gypsy. And that went so terribly. And I think it's partly because, I grew up in New Hampshire. I'm like an 80s baby. And in the 70s, pretty much all the Roma in New Hampshire were run out. Roma used to have like a trade route that went through New Hampshire. And so I think people's parents knew what that meant and had strong feelings about it, especially in the part of New Hampshire I was in, kind of closer to the White Mountains at the time. So kids threw stones at me. I had a teacher give me detention for giving the evil eye, which is it's a Gypsy stereotype. A lot of cultures believe in the evil eye, but including us, but there's a strong belief among other people who are not Romani that Romani women especially give the evil eye and can make bad things happen to you. That whole Gypsy curse thing that horror movies love to play with. And then it kind of escalated, and there were lots of reasons why we ended up moving from that town, but that was one of them. Then when I moved to a new town, I was in Hampstead, New Hampshire. Didn't say a word to anyone about who I was or why, except maybe like my best friend later. But then when I was about 10 as well, I was wearing one of our traditional head coverings. It's called a diklo. Most Romani women in particular would wear it, but anyone can wear one, as far as I'm concerned, among other Roma. It's not gendered. Wear one if you want to, honey. But I was wearing one more for fun because they're usually for married women. I just thought they were so pretty. My grandma was like, sure, knock yourself out. And I was walking down the streets of Concord with one of my friends, and 5 cop cars pulled up around me. And a police officer came out and said, we have a picture of you. You're a runaway. We know you're a nomad. And I was like, my dad is down the street. And I was starting to panic. I was terrified. I thought I was going to be arrested. I thought I was going to be shot. I was looking at their guns. And they kept yelling at me, "We know you're a runaway. And I said, just take me to my dad." And the whole production took probably like an hour. They didn't believe me. They were telling me that I was running away. I was living on the train tracks. I was a nomad. It was really, really scary. And they finally took me to my dad. And my dad was like, "Yeah, that's my daughter." And they were like, "Why is she dressed like this?" And he was like, just our grandma gave her that. And they were like, "Well, you wasted our time." They started yelling at me after. They were saying I was being bad. And I was so terrified. And I didn't even understand that things like that could happen. And it's also, I think, a little weird. I think that people kind of know what a gypsy looks like. And if you look like that, they think it's a bad thing. But when I got a little older, I learned that a lot of American police forces have anti-gypsy task forces. And so they're given these really racial profiling kind of lists to things to look out for. And so little girls in declos, I guess, was one of them. And as I got older and started being more public about my heritage, just because I'm a writer and I studied writing in college, and I was encouraged by professors to write about my, lived experience. And I was like, "Oh shit, I gotta talk about this now." But I found I actually wanted to. I had all these amazing stories. My grandmother survived so much, my mother and auntie especially too. And I eventually became a writing professor. I was an adjunct professor for maybe almost 10 years. In New York and Florida. And I regularly had students complain that they didn't want a gypsy for a professor. I taught maybe one Romani literature story in my global literature class, and I always had complaints. But then I also had students who loved my class. I would have 95% fantastic student reviews. And yet I was called into the dean's office for the couple of very clearly racist students that I had every semester. And I was scolded for being too gypsy. I actually had the dean say, "Can you just stop talking about it?" And I was like, "I don't think you can ask me legally to hide my ethnicity." And she just looked at me, and I looked at her because I'm an adjunct and I don't have a contract. But I think she was calculating, maybe she can sue us or maybe they can sue us, Yeah, and things like that continued. And especially when I went over to Romania to do a Romani poetry festival with the great Romani poet Luminita Mihai Cioaba, who's incredible, and you should look up her work. She has many books, and they're translated into English. I really got my privilege checked because I was dressing more traditionally there to be respectful of elders and to just kind of be in the moment. And people were spitting at us. We had, waiters refusing to serve us. I was not allowed in certain shops. It was just oh, they really hate us. And I even had a shopkeeper come outside because I was sort of lingering outside thinking I wanted to maybe get some souvenirs for my parents. But I was like, "Oh, is it worth going in there?" And he came to the door and he was like, "Are you Romani?" Or he actually said, he said something in Romanian, and I was like, "I don't know, I speak English." And then he was like, "Are you a gypsy?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "You're welcome in my shop. I love gypsies and Jews." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you." But I was like, this sucks that you have to say that though. And so that's so tame. There's housing discrimination, police brutality is wild. There's, Romani, especially young Romani men are being shot and killed, much the way young Black men are being shot and killed in the US. And so these experiences of discrimination at work and things like that, I'm quite privileged. And I had these experiences that made me uncomfortable. I've had worse experiences where I've been assaulted because of someone understood that I was Romani. We don't need to get into that. But basically much worse things happen. These are my fun stories.
Oh, great. Yeah. Having loads of fun hearing them. How difficult was this emotionally? I mean, you talked about all of this kind of it didn't mean that much to us listening, but I imagine for you, what was it like growing up being told, "Hey, don't talk about who you are, keep your identity and your heritage a secret," and then later in your life to have these experiences that you just spoke about? How difficult was that emotionally? And do you feel like there's lingering traumatic effects from that?
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things that I don't think a lot about until it comes up again. Because like most people in the world, I've also had worse things happen to me. But I do have this feeling of wanting to be careful. Like this sounds a little wild, but every single time I read for someone, I want to give the context for what I'm doing. And so I have a little spiel that I give where I'm like, I read in my Romani family tradition. Roma are a diasporic ethnic group originally from India. And I explained that because of persecution, we've been kind of limited to the traditional trades that we do. Luckily, we have a lot of really, really cool trades: metalworking, lace making, animal training, performing, and fortune telling is one of them. And I explained that it's a survival trade. And my grandmother taught me. And then I also explained that, you have your own free will and everything, but this is how we navigate if you want to. And every time I do that, I'd say like 90% of the time people are like, oh, nice, cool, because it's a different New Hampshire than the one I grew up in, thankfully. But sometimes I have people react badly. Like one time I had this woman who was also a person of color, so I found this really strange to me, but she was like, are you the people who steal? And I thought at this time in my life that I was just so like hardened to those experiences that I was just like, whatever, I'll be angry about it later. But I've noticed that that's not really happening to me anymore. And I don't know if it's because, I haven't been working in academia for a long time. I had a really rough couple of years. I got COVID, became chronically ill and disabled. My mom died, my auntie died, and my grandma just died. And so I think now when I'm like doing this family trade where I'm kind of bearing myself to people, I'm actually more sensitive. And I had a moment where I like almost started to cry in front of her, and it shocked her so much. And I was like, I'm sorry, I just need a moment because that was unnecessarily cruel. And I think that was actually, if we're looking at like what actually is more effective, that was more effective in the moment, because she was like, oh, I'm not a bad person. And I was like, why would you say that? Like, why would you say that? And she couldn't answer. And I think that I'm okay now with like when I have an emotional reaction to this, to not, because when I was a kid, especially with my grandma, she had survived so many horrific things, truly stories that would just shake you. And she was always just like, be strong. Don't let them see you flinch. Like, you're strong. We're like weeds. They can't kill us. And now I'm like, I'm sorry, you hurt my feelings. But I think that's good. We should be talking about it. And I did the reading for her and everything, but I needed a minute. And so it definitely does still affect me. And I think I love working at Deadwick's because they're very kind to me. And whenever we do have people who are using the word gypsy inappropriately, they care about it, or if people are being racist to me or whatever. But luckily it doesn't happen that much. I think also the setting that we create is very much like, I'm giving you a cultural experience. Please come along for the ride. So even if you did have prejudices, most people are polite enough to not say them to my face. But yeah, so it definitely is something that I constantly navigate. And I think it was probably much harder for me growing up than I understood at the time. But I also had other very difficult things going on. I didn't have an easy childhood. So it wasn't the thing I was thinking about the most.
Really quick before we talk about fortune telling, first of all, I'm sorry that you've had to endure all of that and that your family's had to endure all of that, especially your last few years, particularly. That sounds terrible. What are the best ways that us non-Romani people can support the Romani people and make you guys feel safe and welcome everywhere?
That is such a great question. I just heard the cutest story ever. I think maybe Paulina told it to me, my co-host, but someone did. And it was basically like this client of hers was telling her that she was hanging out with some people that she didn't know very well. And she heard them tossing around the word gypsy, and she didn't really hear the full context of it. But she was like, hey, just to let you know, that's actually a racial slur. And Roma people really prefer that only non-Romani people use the correct terms like Roma and Romani. And they were like, oh, honey, thank you so much, but we're actually gypsies. And she was mortified. But I was like, no, that's so kind. Like, to have to do, for y'all to do the work that is exhausting to us, to constantly be like, okay, so the thing is actually about that. I'm sure you don't know, honey. I'm sure you don't know. But just to tell you, for us to not have to do that as much as we do is so good. And so I think just like supporting Romani creators and artists and, business people, et cetera, and, learning a little bit about the culture and the stigma. And then when you encounter it yourself, because the stakes are so much lower for you, to just be like, hey, like as a fellow non-Romani person, this is a thing that I learned. And I wanted to share this with you because you just used the word gypped and you probably didn't even know, but it has this like horrifying background. And they're more likely to be nicer to you than us about it or feel less embarrassed. And so doing that kind of allyship where if, you see a Romani person being discriminated against or something, like it's much easier for you to go to the, correct authorities about it or report it at work or something. I had to do all the reporting of all of the discrimination I got at work. I didn't even get into, an old professor who told me that maybe I could get tenure if I just let him cozy up to me because he had a gypsy girlfriend in Spain and you're so fiery and I can put in a good word for you. And I was just like, is anyone else hearing this? I don't want to go tell the dean now. And so like, if you can kind of do that allyship and ask like, would you like me to talk to someone about this? Because I've had that happen at work, especially in fortune telling. Someone's like, oh, I'm calling myself Gypsy, whatever, but I can do that because I'm a mutt or like I'm Egyptian or whatever. And it's like, honey, it's not the same. I've had coworkers be like, you want me to tell the supervisor? Because I know she's not supposed to be doing that. It's like, oh my God, please and thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So you and your podcast co-host, Paulina, are now co-authors or soon to be co-authors. Yeah. You are releasing a book that is coming out in October 2024. And you kindly shared kind of a synopsis of the book and what to expect. And something that caught my attention in the synopsis was you said that fortune telling is a survival adaptation, not a mystical power. What exactly do you mean by that?
Oh, it's such a fun thing to talk about. So we quote one of my favorite writers, Oksana Marafiati, in the book to talk about this. And I'm going to really condense a lot of what she says. But she's basically makes the point, and a lot of other Romani people make this point, that first, the trades like palmistry, cartomancy, other types of divination, tea leaf reading, coffee reading, they have come with Roma through our origins many centuries ago. And so there are these trades that we have. But she's also explained that Roma have had to navigate genocide and a lot of horrific violence over the centuries. And you get very good at reading people and you get very good at reading a room and kind of being like, am I safe? What's their body language saying to me? What's the energy here? Did I get a weird dream last night? Like you really start to get attuned to like, am I going to survive this encounter? And that can lead to a belief that Romani people, wow, you really know how to read a room and read a vibe. You must be magic. And sometimes we believe it ourselves. And so, I have the opinion that like everyone has intuition. Everyone can learn techniques. I think a lot of Roma are literally raised to be fortune tellers because they were some of the few jobs that we had available to us. But I also think a lot of Romani people have a pretty finely tuned intuition because we just have to. And I think that's true for any group that's been persecuted or marginalized, or any person who even grew up in an abusive household or something. You walk on eggshells, and that's in part your intuition, in part you just making decisions based on the little micro hints that you get about your safety.
How do Romani people feel about non-Romani people practicing fortune telling and tarot card reading?
Yeah, so that depends. I have met Romani people who are like, these are closed practices. Unless you are practicing your own cultural form of divination, like this is not for you. This is ours. And I get that. I don't really feel that way personally. For me, it's more about how you're doing it. And so, for instance, in New Hampshire, like a lot of the psychic fairs and things I don't work at, because there are a few fortune tellers who call themselves like Gypsy, insert their name. I won't like call them out because it's a little too mean, and they have been asked to not do that by me and other people and they keep doing it. So that, I think, is not appropriate because it's like, oh, cute. Did the police surround you when you were 10? Like in your knockoff trashy gypsy costume at the moment, no one would really mistake you for a real gypsy. But like, have you lived the experience of being a real gypsy? Can you really use that word? No, you're profiting off of it. And like profiting off of not just the work that we've been sort of corralled into, which I happen to love, but also profiting off of our actual persecution. So you can play Gypsy for fun. It's very upsetting to me. But I also think that it's helpful for people to understand that a lot of the practices that they do, like tarot reading, for instance, while tarot cards were likely not created by Romani people were probably the first people who used them as a divination tool and created tarot reading for divination as an actual job. And so I think that if you're in this place where you care about cultural appropriation versus appreciation, it's nice to understand that, like, oh, if I'm a professional tarot reader, I should probably learn about the origins of this, and I should probably be supporting Romani readers and creators, and I should probably try to be a good ally to the Romani community at the very least. And I think that it's been really moving to me that I've had a lot of students seek me out as a teacher, because I teach these things. I'm writing this book with Paulina. We have a podcast where we talk about Roma culture, but we also talk about fortune telling, and just be like, oh, I really just wanted to learn from a Romani person. And, you know, you came recommended. And I'm like, oh, that's so nice. Thank you, honey. You know, and it's, so I'm happy to teach it. Like, learning these trades was the best part of my childhood, really. And spending this time with my grandmother. And I'm so proud of her and everything that she survived and how much she risked to maintain her culture, even when it would have been easier to just come to America and let it go. She decided, like, no, we should be proud. And so even though, you know, I'm mixed and I'm assimilated, I think that that's a Romani experience too, you know, and so I like to share everything that she taught me. And but, well, I'd say everything. There's an asterisk. There are parts of Romani spirituality that are closed practice, and obviously I don't share those. But I share the things that I feel like are already out there enough anyway, and I'm just like giving you the actual real Romani take on it, or at least my family's version of it. And I highly recommend that no Romani person should be the final word on all Romani culture. We all have our opinions. There are over 62 vitsas or clans, so like subgroups of Romani people. We have a lot of diversity. And so Romani opinions on fortune telling vary in a lot of different ways. And so seek out lots of different Romani creators and see what you think.
There's probably a lot of people listening to this and just out in the world who are skeptical of fortune telling and the entire industry that you're a part of. How do you spot, I suppose, what are the telltale signs for us who don't know any better of a scam, of a scam psychic, a scam palm reader? How do we know who's legit and who's not?
I think that the thing that I care most about, because sometimes there are fortune tellers who are doing their best and they're maybe just not that good. And so I don't think that's a scam. I think they're really trying, because it's not an easy job, you know? And so it's like, why would you do this otherwise? But then there are some people who are scammers and they really try to make money off of you. And I think those are pretty easy to spot because they are usually creating some kind of threat or urgency for their services. And so, and this is not just Romani people, it's, you know, anyone can be a scammer in any industry, not just fortune telling. And I feel like this is good advice in general. Like if someone calls you and is like, we need you to give us 100 Amazon gift cards right now. Like if there's urgency, it's a scam, honey, you know, like, and so I've definitely had people come to me after bad experiences where they've been like, oh, I went to this reader and she told me that I had this horrible curse on me. And if I didn't give her $5,000 for this crystal, then I would die. And I was just like, yeah, that's nuts though. Right. And people do fall for it. And I have compassion because these people seek out desperate people who are frightened, or they think that, oh, I have to give her this much money, or I'll never meet my true love. Or I heard this one, which was terrible. One reader, this was even in New Hampshire or Maine, I'm not sure, but they said that to a woman who had lost her child, like tragically, it was like, oh, he's not at rest. You have to give me this much money and I'll get his soul out of purgatory. And it's like, wow, that is dark. And so there's always like a high stakes that they create. Usually it's a lot of money. I don't think the money itself is the thing. Some people are really good at what they do and they charge appropriately. I'm always criticized by my friends for undercharging, always offering sliding scale. Yeah. And so I don't, you know, if someone's expensive, they're expensive. I don't think that's a red flag. But it's that manipulation, and because that's not true. And if you were working with a medium and you felt like their soul wasn't at rest, like you doing whatever services for them would be like part of the experience. It was like, well, let's do some elevation prayers right now or something like that. If that's what you really thought, you wouldn't use it to manipulate the person to give you much, much more.
So I work in podcasting. I have this podcast. I have very few hobbies and I want to pick up more. And as I think about approaching the new year and what I want to do in 2024 for hobbies, I've been thinking about maybe I should get into the whole psychic thing, tarot cards, palm readings, crystals, which are very trendy right now. It's just all been fascinating to me. What is the best starting point for someone like me who wants to pick this up as a hobby? Where should I go? Who should I talk to? What should I buy?
So like I was saying, if there's something you want to learn specifically from a tradition, I think it's nice to like find teachers of that tradition. And so like if you were going to learn runes or something, go to someone who maybe like has a kind of Scandinavian background and is really invested in preserving Scandinavian culture. And so, I think that it's nice to go to the source of things. But as far as, what to start with, I think the most important question is like, what do you like? Because anything can be easy or hard for anybody. And so if you like the idea of like shuffling cards and seeing what comes up for you every day, I think an oracle deck is a really cool way to just start getting used to that, because usually there are like words and phrases already on there. But if you know that you love the idea of learning 78 cards, go for a tarot deck. And maybe you want to go for the most recognizable one, like the Smith Rider-Waite deck, because it's in the public domain. So a lot of artists do variations upon it, and you could pick up any tarot deck and kind of easily recognize the symbols more or less. But, I taught a divination class for kids. Like I teach a lot because I love it. And I was so impressed because I think scrying is very difficult, which is basically the art of gazing into anything and looking for symbols. And, it's something that I found I had to work at. And I put these little, obsidian balls and crystal balls in front of the kids that I was teaching. And they were immediately like, I saw a turtle. And I was like, oh, wow, they're doing great. So, if that's your thing, if you like gazing at things, if you love staring at a campfire, maybe scrying is your thing.
Okay. What about, a good merging of, I'm obsessed with coffee, making coffee, roasting coffee readings are a thing.
Yeah.
How do I get into that?
So I have a class on it, but there are, there are books on it. Coffee reading is a little less maybe written about than tea leaf reading, but in our book, we cover it. And I think that you can, even if you're not, using a source, I think the most important thing for people who are learning how to be intuitive, work with their intuition, is to really think about what symbols actually mean to you. And so I think the mistake that people make a lot when they're like, oh, I had a dream about a crocodile. I should look up what a crocodile means in every single culture. And there are different meanings in all of them. And now I'm overwhelmed and scared and I don't know what crocodiles mean, because in China, they mean this. And in, for indigenous people, it means this. And it's like, well, what does it mean to you? Like, what do you associate with a crocodile? And if they're like Peter Pan, then it's like, let's work with that. And so these signs come to you specifically for a reason. And maybe there's also like your personal cultural background, but it doesn't really make sense to be looking for influences that have nothing to do with you as the answer. And I think that it's also, so if you were, made a cup of coffee and you were reading the grounds, might be interesting for you to just look and see if any symbols stand out to you, and then have your journal next to you and start journaling about like, oh, okay, I saw a ship. What do I associate with ships? And kind of do like a word association of like maybe travel, or maybe like adventure, or maybe like trade or business or something like that. And then you might try to piece together a scene and see like all the symbols and think about like, okay, it's like almost analyzing artwork. Like, how does this all relate? What does this all mean to me? And kind of take your power back in it. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, I don't know what it means. But they're there for you.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. I can't wait to check out that chapter in your book later next year. So I want to do a little experiment here with you. I want to have you read my palm quickly, and then I want to kind of ask you what I should do with this information of what you're going to tell me. So I'm going to drop my microphone here. I'm going to take yours. You're going to film this on your phone, and then I'll give you my palm, okay? Don't mind my calluses, everyone.
So did I tell you you were fire last time I read for you?
Yes.
Yeah, you're very fire. And so the way that I determine your dominant element, so everyone has all the elements within them, you do that by measuring the palm. And so you have a long palm, like a rectangular palm, but like shorter fingers in proportion. And so that would indicate that your palm is predominantly the element of fire. But also just kind of looking at your palm and like your hand is giving off some heat. There's a kind of like, for instance, air usually has much like thinner, kind of like narrow, kind of like wispy kind of energy. Fire is like, I'm here. There's a little bit of weight to the palm, but it's also still very like dynamic and flexible. And a lot of Romani readers would also notice the calluses and kind of think like, well, you do something with your hands, like you're doing something. But even just from getting into the more mystical part of it. So I think asserting what the element is helpful because that tells you about the personality and nature. And so someone with a lot of fire would be a very like dynamic person, usually really loyal and dedicated. They usually have a strong sense of purpose. And they also kind of like to be around other people who have a sense of purpose, and they like to be around other inspirational people, but they also like to inspire and like get people on board with things. And so it's so funny because I didn't know you had this podcast, but I'm like, that's like your whole thing. And so, other cool things about fire is that they do have a lot of gifts of healing, and they tend to be really good at like fixing things, fixing people up, but they also often might go into medicine or other kind of healing trades or do things with their hands that are healing in some way. And so I've met like people who had a lot of fire who were like chefs, and they love to cook for people and like create nourishing meals.
That's not me.
Yeah. And so the healing thing can show up in a lot of different ways. And there are certain things that like I would look for. Usually someone who actually works in medicine would have the short little line here indicating that they've saved someone's life. And so usually if I see someone with a lot of fire and they have the lines indicating that and emphasizing being a healer, I would be like, oh, so do you actually work in medicine? And usually, yeah. Or they're massage therapists or something like that who maybe can do CPR. But for your hand, it's more of the artistic kind of expressive, kind of like healing, fixing, getting things moving. And so I think it's nice to know these things about your nature, especially if you're kind of like, am I in the right place? Or like, is this something that is like a strength that I have? Like, I find that reflecting on these things like palm reading is good for kind of like reorienting yourself in yourself. You also have your business finger is kind of curving toward your relationship finger. And so that means that a lot of the work that you do is sort of more interested in people and developing like relationships and connections with people that feel authentic. And so it's not just networking for strategy. It's like you actually want to create a kind of community, which makes sense with a content creator. Like you want a community. And then once I kind of established some things about fire, and I always like to remind folks with a lot of fire that they have an inverse relationship to health. They're much more likely to burn themselves out. I have fire as well. And so it's really important for folks with fire to actually learn self-care and pacing themselves. And I usually, depending on what I see in the palm, will kind of talk about maybe some specific things that they struggle with. This is one of my favorite lines. It's this thick line that kind of shows up as a fold. And sometimes people have several of them, but they show up when you're doing like some intergenerational healing. If you're, healing something in your family, breaking intergenerational trauma cycles, things like that. And usually there's like a lucky symbol that will show up here, like an evil eye. And that emphasizes how protected you are as you're doing that work. And so if you have someone maybe who's thinking like, I have a lot of addiction that runs in my family, and I notice that like I kind of do drink emotionally or something. Should I maybe just be sober before it becomes a problem? If you kind of like, oh, you're doing a lot of intergenerational cycle breaking, that person might be like, yeah, I think I should. And so I think it's helpful to listen to what actually resonates in a reading with someone and then be like, does this like connect with me or lead me to something that I was already feeling like I should need? Or did I hear that and I was like, oh, wow, I needed to hear that. And then kind of think about what's the action that comes from that. because I really like to emphasize how we have choices. And, this part of this is your lifeline. Let's see. Yeah, and the lifeline usually wraps around this part of the palm, which is like the Mound of Venus. It deals with family, community, and ancestry. Most of our lives are kind of built around those things. You might have a lifeline that goes way over here, and it's like, wow, you're really like living your own life. You're not so connected to those things. Yours has an interesting path where part of it is very close to community, but then you have a branch that kind of goes off on your own direction. And so there's a sense, and that's more connected to this line, which is represents your work and career. And so there's a sense of you being very connected to community and caring a lot about, family and maintaining connection, but also having a part of you that is maybe doing things that's unexpected for a family or kind of going off in your own direction, a kind of more non-traditional branch. And so sometimes you have people who kind of like are straddling those two things. And then you have a strong entrepreneur line here, which is basically runs next to this like fate line here. And your fate line is, this is a line of like career, what you do. A lot of it in the beginning is kind of dispersed. And I think that can be helpful for people to hear because if you haven't really, in the beginning of your life, already immediately picked the direction that you're in and you stay there forever, if you kind of see like, oh, your line is dispersed, you're collecting all this interesting like experience in different places. And you might talk about how yours is still aligned with like ambition and kind of finding purpose. That can be so reassuring where it's like, oh, I'm not a screw up. I'm just, this is how I learn. And so, because I think we're given a lot of, or we're put a lot of pressure on us. Many of us grow up with pressure to just pick a thing and stay there. And so fire is super dynamic and creative. They learn by doing. And so for you to have this dispersed fate line where it's like, oh, all of your experiences eventually condense into a path. And then you have this entrepreneurship line where it's like, and you like do your own thing. You create your own business. I think hearing that potential, if that's like, yeah, that is something I want to do, it can be encouragement to go do that. It's like, it's written in my palm. But it's also cool to remember that the lines on your palm change, especially as you make choices, as you age. And so some things that I see that people might struggle with, for instance, this is the love and relationships line. Usually people are, this is the line that changes a lot because we make a lot of changes in our lives. And so yours is kind of low set on the palm at the moment, but you also have some wispy lines that are kind of coming up and around. So when you have a love line that's kind of low set on the palm, it's usually, and so not starting up here, but starting down here. It's usually indicating a real love for love. And it can be kind of someone who just like wants to soak up like all of the love and also, be in like really loving, generous relationships with people. But sometimes that can also mean that folks like struggle a little bit with boundaries and might kind of tolerate more than they want to, or say yes to this thing that they don't really want to do because they just like don't want to ruin the vibe. And but because you have these like little wispy lines where you're starting to see, especially because it's coming up to this ambition part rather than just like where you would expect it to be, there's something about your ambition that has actually helped you make better boundaries, because it might just be like, well, I don't have time for that, or it's not in alignment with what I want to do. And so your ambition might help you also see too that when you speak frankly and directly with people and honestly, it kind of gives them more information about how to love you and respect you. And so when you're in good relationships and you're like, oh, I don't have time for that, they can be like, oh, no problem. Like, that's okay. I'll ask someone else. And that can be really, really reassuring. And so you're starting to have these lines of like stronger boundaries come up. And you also have these little lines going back toward this part of the lifeline, which represents early childhood, which means that you're probably reflecting on some of those childhood experiences, like, why maybe boundaries maybe weren't seen as like a good thing when you were a kid, or if you were given like opposite examples of how boundaries could be scary or something. And so a lot of these cycle breaking things that you're doing are kind of like coming into the relationships line. And like most people with a lot of fire, you have a ton of influence, like people who are important to you, like close friends, because the love in relationships, it's not just, romantic love. Not everyone even is someone who likes romantic love. So like friends and important people can show up here, as well as, whoever you're in romantic relationship with. And so knowing that you might be the type of person who really loves to be around people, or like likes to have interesting relationships with interesting people or friendships, I usually say like, oh, so this is the type of person who it's good for you not to have a jealous partner, because they have to be cool with you having an interesting social life and like connecting with people, and it not meaning that you don't care about them. And then you have this headline, which is like your learning. And yours is super interconnected with your lifeline, which indicates it's like almost like a huge band here. Like they're very interconnected. So I think it's helpful for folks to know that when that happens, it can mean that you were a kid with a lot of imagination, and that a lot of your intellectual interests from when you were a child continue to serve you really well. And that a lot of those skills that you learned maybe to cope with stress, or, being a baby is hard. You don't have control over anything. Even if your childhood is good, there's like stressors to being a child. So a lot of the coping mechanisms that you use continue to serve you. And so if you feel like you've sort of fallen away a little bit from like childlike joy, that can be a reminder to return back to that. And your headline is very long, and it branches off in different directions. And one of the branches that you have slopes downward, which usually emphasizes there's something you want to learn, but there's self-doubt or fear there. And so I think that's a good thing to remind people that like self-doubt or fear just means you're afraid. It doesn't mean you're not capable. That's something you can work with. And so that's a good point to be like, so this other thing that you really want to learn, like just go for it. Like it's there. It's very available to you. And that crosses over your creativity and expression line. And it tends to be in the part of the pond that is indicating like spiritual practices. And so it's interesting, you're interested in getting into more spiritual things. If you have some self-doubt or fear there, this feels like, dive into it and just kind of make it yours and take the pressure off of it and be playful with it, because it's in this part of your palm of like creative expression and playfulness and spiritual gain. And so I think a palm reading can be really helpful in a practical way, because it's about the big picture of your life. And some of the things that you talk about are going to be like way in the future. And some of them might be way in the past. But the idea is that you're kind of getting to know yourself better, and you might feel validated or encouraged, or just kind of know that what you want to do is possible. Like it's always so fun to see, like, if you've always wanted your own business and you have some great ideas and you say to someone, oh, you have an entrepreneurship line, have you been considering that? And they're like, yes. And it's like, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's so funny. All of the things that you said, or most of the things you said, I was saying in my head, oh my gosh, he's right. And I'm sure the audience who knows me is like, oh my, that is spot on, Troy. This is now the fourth time I've gotten my palms read, or third time. The first time I ever did it was in the summer of 2018. I was on a boardwalk in upstate New York, and the lady read my love line, and she said, she was more like prediction space. You're going to meet the love of your life, the person that you're going to spend the rest of your life with within the next calendar year. 8 months after that, I met a woman who I labeled as, you're the person.
Yeah.
And then I spent a long time, too long, pursuing that person, because I'm like, it's in my hand. It's you. I know it's you. And so then I kind of oriented my life and what I wanted based on this 2018 palm reading. Is that something that when we get our palms read or our tarot cards read, do we take that information and then try to orient our lives around it? Or is it just a tool to help us make decisions and things? How much stock do we put into it,
That is such a great question. And sometimes I'll even say to people who maybe want their palms read and they're like, I want to know when I'm going to get married. I usually say I don't do predictive things like that, because we constantly misunderstand and misinterpret. And so what I usually tend to do is talk about like energetic tendencies. And I like to use tarot, this is me personally, for some more specific things where it can be like, well, what's the relationship like with this person? What do I need to keep in mind about this person? And sometimes when the relationship is going well at the beginning, the tarot cards might be like, yeah, have a nice time, but that doesn't mean forever and always. And so you might check in when a problem arises and when the person has decided not to deal with the problem, because we have free will. and be like, oh, this person is not going to work on this with you. I don't think this is going to work. But at the beginning, when everyone was on board and they're like, let's do this, the tarot cards were like, yeah, you should do this. And I think that, that's when you get into like, well, maybe experiences are meaningful to us, even if we only have them for a short time. Maybe this relationship started out great and I learned something really important, and it's okay that it ended because it's not a failure. It's just how we move through life. And so I think that you take readings with a grain of salt. You kind of take what resonates, but I don't try to like force predictions to happen. And I also am usually wary of people who give those hard and fast predictions, because there's so many elements like free will and fate and all these things interplaying that it's kind of hard to make those really accurately. Usually when the accuracy in readings comes that specific, it's more in the present. Like I've done readings for so many people who are in really toxic relationships, and it came up in the first 3 cards. And it's like, are you feeling like this is maybe an unsafe situation for you? And they're like, yeah. But I ask, instead of being like, your relationship is bad, because maybe it's a relationship with their dad. So I'll say like, this is what I'm seeing in a relationship. And I want to give the person the ability to use their own voice in the reading if they want to. And so I think that as a reader, you have to be really respectful of people's free will and also other people's free will around them. And so my reading style tends not to be super predictive that way. But sometimes people ask me, is this a good time for me to sell my house? And I'll pull a tarot card and it'll be like the 10 of Pentacles. And it's like, yeah, it does look like a good time to do that. But you still get to make that choice,
Right. Yeah. To push back a little, because I'm sure there's skeptics, is saying that, well, you have free will, is that kind of a cop-out for the predictions? Because it's like, well, here's this prediction, but you can do whatever you want. So isn't that kind of, it can invalidate the prediction if it's wrong?
I mean, if you want to look at it that way, sure. I honestly don't care if people don't believe in it. Like, I don't have any personal investment in it. But it's also just true. Like, everyone has free will, unless you're like a Calvinist and you think we don't, in which case we're having different conversations. Sure. If that makes it less valuable to you, that's okay. I don't care. I just want you to be happy.
So as we wrap up here, I want to talk to you about podcast, book, all of the stuff that you do, you're writing. I'm curious, why do you do all of this? What does it make you feel? Why are you proud to do this stuff?
I really like that people find it useful. I think that for me, my grandmother gave me some really good rules to go by with reading. And, my friend Paulina, who I'm writing the book with and, doing the podcast with, she was not given a choice about being a fortune teller. Like she grew up in a more traditional society than I did. It was like, this is what you do in the family. She also happened to be very gifted at it. So they were like, you are our diamond. Like, you are going to do this. And she wasn't given any choice. And she was taken out of school when she was in middle school. And she was, she had an arranged marriage when she was 17, which is not something that all Romani people do, but some do. And that's actually a practice born of slavery and trying to protect women from being sexually assaulted by slave owners. You marry them very young. And so not all Roma do that. It's not an inherently Roma thing. That's another adaptation. Then, she has this amazing story that she shared with the LA Times podcast, Foretold, which I highly recommend you listen to, how she broke out of that. But she ended up going back to fortune telling because she was like, I actually love this. And she had this amazing transformation where she thought her culture was this oppressive, nightmarish culture. But it was actually the circumstances that she was born into were oppressive and nightmarish. And it wasn't the culture. And so it's been so beautiful for us to have this podcast where we talk about how much we love our Romani culture. And we also talk about we don't want to do arranged marriages for anybody. We talk about other things that we want to change. And, if you're an adult and you want to have an arranged marriage, that's fine. But no kids. And so we love what we do. For me, I was given a choice at the beginning. But my grandmother was like, you can do whatever you want, baby. But this is the job that we've done for centuries. Would you like to learn it? And she taught me because I had, this is where like the magical part comes into it. Cause I don't like to push the magic onto people, but like, I'm into it. When I was a kid, I was like 3 years old. I like marched up to her, put both of my hands on her knees. Her knees were really painful because she had arthritis. And she said that I tore the pain out of her and threw it across the room and then marched off. And she was like, oh, she'll be good at this. And so she was like, this is the one I teach to be a fortune teller. And she didn't teach my other cousins, because she didn't see the gift in them. And so she asked me if it was something I would like. And I couldn't wait, and I got to spend all this beautiful time learning this cultural art that she was telling me it's meant to be helpful to people. You got to take your ego out of it. It's not about you. Stay humble. You're just giving people information and you're asking them questions, making sure it actually helps them. And so I was really taught that this is an ancient way that we can help people doing the thing that, sure, we were sort of restricted into doing, but maybe we're good at it and maybe we like it. And so it was a beautiful thing for her. I love spending time with her. And I loved it from the beginning. And I did see that it was helpful to people. I don't think that fortune telling is a replacement for therapy or medical advice or any of these things. But if you like it and you find it helpful and you find a reader who you feel like really, gets you or is accurate or, presents things in such a way that it helps you clarify your life, I think that's a great tool. I talk to my friends to give me readings when I have stuff that I'm having trouble seeing clearly myself. And, but I also have a therapist. So, and I go to the doctor. But, so I also found that it's work that puts me in touch with really interesting people. And I love getting to know people. I'm a writer and a performance artist and an artist. I do lots of kind of creative things. And so what better way to marvel at the wonders of humanity than to talk with a stranger about their secrets, and try to be helpful and not to do it to pry into their lives, but be like, okay, honey, let's figure out what you want to do with this house. It's a really loving work for me. And I find that especially, I meant to say folks with a lot of fire, they tend to be more intuitive if they are touching the thing. So touch the tarot card and see if you can feel it. But I also think people in general are more intuitive when they're compassionate. And so I do a loving kindness exercise before I read for anyone. And I do a few deep breaths and I remind myself, I care so much about this person's well-being, even if I've never met them. And it's I want to help them figure out what they want to figure out. Even if they're just there for fun, then let's have a nice time, but do something profound. And that I find so gratifying because almost every single time people are like, that was what I needed to hear. And it's oh, I'm so glad. But I almost feel like I had nothing to do with it because I'm just sort of connecting with them, vibing with their energy, and then they go off into the world. And I'm like, good luck.
Wow. That's so beautiful, everything that you just said there. I'm so glad that you have this thing that means a lot to your family and your people and where you come from, that you can make money on it and that you can share your messages with the world like you have here. On your website, JezminaVonThiele.com, I saw that you offer your services around the world. This is a podcast with a global audience. We're not just confined to New Hampshire. So people can book sessions with you virtually. Yeah,
I have clients in Guam and Europe and all over the place. So yeah, I do online readings and I'm also currently at Deadwick's in Portsmouth, more or less 5 days a week, usually Tuesdays 12 to 6 and Thursdays through Sundays 12 to 6. But I also do events. I've traveled for weddings and things like that. I have to compensate for travel and everything. But if you want me and we can work it out, I'll be there.
That's so cool. Romanistan podcast. The book is coming out in October 2024. TBD title. JezminaVonThiele.com. I'll put all the links in the show notes of this episode, your social media as well. Jezmina, thank you for the palm reading. I'm a proud fire. I think that's the way to say it. And thank you for everything you do. It's really awesome. And thank you for being here.
Thank you for creating this opportunity so I could talk about this. It means so much to me. This is a wonderful example of allyship, is using your platform as an opportunity to uplift and share and educate. So thank you so much.